Today is May 3, 2018, and we are in the Feast of Unleavened Bread, studying the historicity of the Exodus. So before starting, let's ask our Heavenly Family to bless us. Heavenly Family, thank you once again for teaching us how we ought to think about the various traditions that we have received. Thank you for teaching us the foundational principles of truth and love and how to be rid of unrighteousness. Please help us as we study this subject tonight to have a clearer understanding of it than we have right now, and help us to be impacted by it personally and help it to change us for the better. Thank you so much. We ask this in the name of Branch. Amen.
Amen.
As a brief reminder, once again, we are studying the historicity of the Exodus. Briefly, the reason why is because we have come to realize that we cannot just accept books that are in the Bible by tradition. Most people tend to accept whatever books are in the Bible of their church simply because they joined the church and that's it, but haven't really studied it carefully themselves. And we have all been there and done that and realized that it's not really the best way to do things. And so we're examining each writing, whether it's in quote-unquote the Bible or whether it's outside of any particular scripture canon. We think we need to investigate all of them, to see what they say and see what truth they may have in them. And if something isn't true, we want to be able to discern that as well. So when it comes to the first 5 books of the Bible, we've questioned the tradition that they were written by Moses and come to the conclusion that they certainly were not written by Moses, nor do they claim to be. Instead, the Pentateuch, or the Torah, is not the work of any one author. It is several different works by different authors, and those works have been stitched together through a series of editorial processes. Now, this isn't our own conclusion that we just came up with. This is actually something which scholars studying the Bible for the past several hundred years have come to recognize. And these centuries of research in this area has actually uncovered that the Torah is composed of 4 primary sources designated by the letters J, E, P, and D. And in addition to those 4 sources, there are several other sources that are a lot shorter in length that were also included by the final editor of the Torah. And it's also worth mentioning that the sources themselves, J, E, P, and D, do include within them, at least in some places, sources which originated prior to them. So J has its own sources, and some of J's sources it quotes. And so it includes its sources some of the time. Likewise with E, P, and D. So we've been really trying to understand what the Exodus is. Last year during the Feast of Unleavened Bread, we read through the Exodus story in the J source, and then in the E source, and then in the P source, partly to test the documentary hypothesis, and partly to see what each of them say on their own. So when we went through that last year, we came to realize that these sources paint the story of the Exodus in different ways that do not agree with each other in every detail, and that raises the question of what really happened. And that's kind of what we're asking this year. But it's not at all in a trivial sense. We are not seeking to find out what happened just for the sake of knowing what happened. We recognize that the Exodus is a loaded event. It is an event which had a lot of impact. Whatever it was, whether the Exodus is a made-up event or a real event, whether it was some huge mass-scale miraculous event or a smaller, perhaps more behind-the-scenes event in a way in its day, no matter what it was, the Exodus has had a huge impact, and a lot stems from it. And also, it is an event in which it is claimed that Yahweh, the gods of Israel, acted. And we have been able to verify certain other actions of our Heavenly Family through the course of history, such as the resurrection of Jesus. But we haven't studied every event yet in which they are claimed to have acted. But the Exodus is a huge one. So we need to find out, did our Heavenly Family really act in the Exodus? And what was the Exodus? And what is the historical truth of Moses? And what did our Heavenly Family say? What were their instructions? What was their message at that time? And one of the reasons why this is so important is because the sources do certainly differ on that point. Some of them include our Heavenly Family or Yahweh condoning slavery. Some of them do not include anything like that. In the sources in the Pentateuch, there is plenty of instruction concerning various sacrifices and so on. But some of them have a lot of instruction like that. Some of them have very little of that sort of thing. And, Jeremiah, for instance, has a tradition that there was no sacrificial instruction connected to the Exodus. That's in Jeremiah chapter 7, verses 21 and 22. So we have different traditions concerning the Exodus, and we really do want to understand the truth of it. And one of the most important reasons why, is that we really want to understand the character of our Heavenly Family and verifying what they did at that point and what their message was and what they didn't do and what was not their message could have a great deal of impact on how one might view their character. And certainly, if it's the case that our Heavenly Family did not actually condone slavery, let's say, and we have thought that they had, well, then that's a problem. And I would say that our Heavenly Family certainly did not condone slavery, and everything that we have from them that we can verify to actually be from them, anything that we can verify to be from a source of inspiration, is opposed to slavery. And so, yeah, if there's something that claims them to be promoting slavery, well, that's inconsistent with everything else that we know about them. But it is entirely consistent with what we know to be the plan of the enemy to misrepresent our Heavenly Family's character. That said, since some of the sources in the Pentateuch do attribute pro-slavery sayings to Moses and claiming that he got it from Yahweh, well, we need to know the historical truth of those texts which make those sorts of claims especially since if we are going to be bringing this message of truth to the world, and it's connected with Yahweh because that's where we are getting our message, and people say, well, Yahweh, isn't that God who did the Exodus and God spoke of it in the Bible, and isn't that the God who is supposedly to be condoning slavery in this passage and that passage? And I'm using slavery as an example. Certainly it's an important one, but it's not exclusive to that issue. But this certainly does highlight the need to accurately understand the Exodus and, of course, other events. But right now we're focusing on the Exodus. So last night we were reading from Exodus chapter 15, a song often known as the Song of the Sea, sometimes also known as the Song of Miriam, but I think we're realizing that maybe that's not the best title to give it, but sure, we can call it the Song of the Sea for now. That song is apparently, according to scholars and historians and linguists of the Hebrew language, is possibly even the very earliest source on the Exodus. It may go back to the 13th century BC or the 12th century BC, sometime very, very early, and it may in fact be that the J source is basing his Exodus story off of the Song of the Sea. So we really need to understand what this song is saying, what it isn't saying, and whether there's any factual information we can derive from it. So before we get back into really kind of digging into it, would someone like to read the Song of the Sea for us?
I could read it again if nobody else is.
Okay, sure, go ahead.
Okay, Exodus 15. Then Moses and the children of Israel sang this song to Yahweh, and they said, saying, Let me sing to Yahweh, for he triumphed. Horse and its rider he cast in the sea. My strength and song are Yah, and he became a salvation for me. This is my God, and I'll praise him. My father's God, and I'll hail him. Yahweh is a warrior. Yahweh is his name. Pharaoh's chariots and his army he plunged in the sea, and the choice of his troops drowned in the Red Sea. The deeps covered them. They sank in the depths like a stone. Your right hand, Yahweh, awesome in power. Your right hand, Yahweh, crushed the foe. And in your triumph's greatness, you threw down your adversaries. You let go your fury. It consumed them like straw. And by wind from your nostrils, water was massed. Surf piled up like a heap. The deeps congealed in the heart of the sea. The enemy said, I'll pursue. I'll catch up. I'll divide spoil. My soul will be sated. I'll unsheath my sword. My hand will deprive them. You blew with your wind. Sea covered them. They sank like lead in the awesome water. Who is like you among the gods, Yahweh? Who is like you? Awesome in holiness, fearsome with splendors, making miracles. You reached your right hand. Earth swallowed them. You led in your kindness the people you redeemed. You ushered in your strength to your holy abode. Peoples heard. They shuddered. Shaking seized Philistina's residence. Then Edom's chiefs were terrified. Moab's chieftains, trembling, seized them. All Canaan's residents melted. Terror and fear came over them. At the power of your arm, they're silent like stone, till your people passed, Yahweh, till the people you created passed. You'll bring them and plant them in your legacy's mountain, your throne's platform that you made, Yahweh. A holy place, Lord, that your hands reared. Yahweh will reign forever and ever.
Excellent. Thank you for reading that. So we have that song contained in, really to be most specific, it's Exodus 15, verse 1b to 18. And then after that, actually first I'll mention that this is attributed in the Bible with sources revealed to Elliot Friedman to being part of the J source, but this is, the song itself is thought to be older than J and quoted in J, but still we know it from the J source. The next verse, verse 19, is understood to be basically a verse written by the redactor or the editor. And it says, because Pharaoh's horses with his chariots and with his horsemen came in the sea, and Yahweh brought back the water of the sea over them, and the children of Israel had gone on the dry ground through the sea. The next verse is attributed to being part of the E source, again, verse 20, and it's something that we have kind of questioned whether it really is part of the E source or whether it properly belongs to J. And hey, we should be willing to consider other possibilities as well, but I know last year we thought, maybe this makes more sense as part of J. In any case, this is what it says. And Miriam, the prophetess, Aaron's sister, took a drum in her hand, and all the women went out behind her with drums and with dances. And Miriam sang to them, "Sing to Yahweh, for he triumphed. Horse and its rider he cast in the sea." And Ed pointed out last night that those two lines there are actually the same as the first two lines of the Song of the Sea in the beginning of the chapter. So is it a doublet? Is it something that's part of the same source, and Miriam is kind of singing that first part again, kind of in response or as a second performance? What exactly is going on? So that's one of the questions that we ask. So I think it'll be good for us to go back over the Song of the Sea in more detail from the beginning. But there are two issues that we kind of had last night in mind. One of them is the one I just mentioned, is verse 20 from the E source, and thus it, along with chapter 15, verses 1 to 18, those two are doublets of each other. Is that the case? Is this a doublet situation? Or is verse 20 not actually part of the E source and perhaps instead part of J? So that's one thing. And then the other thing is, here in Exodus 15, what is actually being described? The Song of the Sea has certain phrases, such as in verse 4, Pharaoh's chariots and his army, he, referring to Yahweh, he plunged in the sea. And the choice of his troops drowned in the sea. The deeps covered them. They sank in the depths like a stone. Well, that part kind of seems to give the picture that they were tossed into the sea and they sank, rather than the sea being parted and them going through it. But then later, in verse 8, for example, it says, and by wind from your nostrils, water was massed, surf piled up like a heap. The deeps congealed in the heart of the sea. Going to verse 9, the enemy said, I'll pursue, I'll catch up, I'll divide spoil. My soul will be sated, I'll unsheath my sword, my hand will deprive them. Verse 10, again speaking to Yahweh, you blew with your wind, sea covered them, they sank like lead in the awesome water. Well, there in verse 8, perhaps especially, it could come across as, hey, talking about the whole idea of water being divided and then collapsing in on them again. So we have different verses of this that, at least on the surface, seem to convey different ideas. So this is one of our questions. Does the Song of the Sea present this event as being the sea parted, as we're used to thinking of it, like in the movies, or is it presenting a picture where they are actually just tossed into the sea, or what? What's really happening? So, does anyone have any comments or questions regarding any of that?
Yeah, this is Ed. Yeah, I'm not really seeing, it seems like it would be talking about them passing in dry land. It doesn't even mention, the Israelites passing through, or, it seems like if there was the dry land, if the sea parted, there was dry land, there would be mention of dry land that they're passing through the sea on, and the walls and so on. And, it's sort of, in my mind, that second part is more just giving some detail as to how they were, like Yahweh being the storm god and sort of blowing and sweeping them into the sea by wind, and then the waves being, the surf being mounted up and kind of forcing them into the water or whatever, almost maybe a tsunami kind of a picture or something like that. I just think it's kind of describing. And then also, and I don't know how important it is, the whole part of the Song of Miriam part being, source E or source P, but it seems to me that because there's the redactor portion, that tells me that it kind of probably is a separate source, because why would the redactor take part of the J source and separate it out, and put a redaction between it? Like if it was part of the J source, then it's sort of a reaction to the Song of the Sea that Miriam's doing. But because the redactor's in there, it almost makes it like a separate event altogether. So anyway, that's just some comments.
Yeah, that's pretty interesting. I guess there are some things that I could say about those elements too, but first, does anyone else have something to say regarding those elements? All right, well, I'll mention my thoughts on it. So yeah, following the same order, in reading the Song of the Sea, the first part talking about how he plunged them into the sea or he tossed them into the sea, it is very reminiscent of earlier in J, where it says, let's see, in verse 27 of chapter 14, it says, and the sea went back to its strong flow toward morning, and Egypt was fleeing toward it, and Yahweh tossed the Egyptians into the sea. And then the next J verse is verse 30, which says, and Yahweh saved Israel from Egypt's hand that day, and Israel saw Egypt dead on the seashore. Well, that's pretty interesting. Rather than them being at the bottom of the sea, like in the middle of the sea, maybe they sunk to the bottom, but they're still in the shallows, So they saw them there dead on the seashore. So that's kind of interesting because even though the J author may not have been the author of the Song of the Sea, the J author certainly lived at a time closer, and if he's really using the Song of the Sea as his source, which of course, if it's older and he's including it here, it sure seems like he's using it as a source. Well, it seems like he is understanding it to be describing not the sea parting, because that's not what he describes. He describes it as, the sea drying up or something, and then it returns to its strong flow after Israel has crossed, and then Pharaoh's army is thrown into the sea, and they're dead on the seashore. So at least the way it seems that the J author interpreted the Song of the Sea not as though it's describing the sea being parted with walls of water or anything like that. Seems like he's understanding it in the way that we just described. And yeah, I hear you also, Ed, that in verse 8, when it talks about water being massed and the surf piling up, well, that doesn't actually describe a sea being parted. I mean, if you have the idea of a parted sea in your mind, then sure, maybe it could be described using some of those terms. But if you just start with what it says and, not come to it with the idea in mind of the sea actually being parted down all the way to the bottom, and you read it, it could just simply be talking about large waves, things being like massed up as waves. And so that kind of can easily give that idea, and then that's more in harmony with the rest of it, with the idea of sinking and them being plunged into the sea or tossed into the sea. So I think I'm agreeing with what Ed was saying in relation to this. As far as verse 20, as to how important it is, I don't know either. But it may be, whether it's two independent witnesses could be important. But one thing that I'll mention is in terms of the redactor idea, as you were mentioning that, Ed, I was kind of just skimming through it to see, like, okay, well, how about other things attributed to the redactor? Are there places where the redactor kind of inserts a statement in the middle of his own source, like in the middle of one source, interrupting one source and then continuing? Or is it always the case or more usual for the redactor to insert something between sources? And, we'd have to go through it in a lot more detail in order to see kind of what is most prominent. But I'm definitely seeing both practices. I'm seeing times where the redactor quotes a section from one source, puts in a saying, and then continues on into a different source. But then I'm also seeing times where it's just like all J, and then the redactor sticks something in the middle. One example that I'm seeing is in Genesis 15, where it's J, 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 from the beginning of the chapter up until verse 13, and then verses 13 to the first part of 17 is a redactional note, I guess, and then it continues on with J up until verse 3 of chapter 16. So that's one example of that sort of thing. And I'm seeing others like that too, but there are also plenty of times where it goes from E, and then there's a redactor, and then it goes to J, or there's something between E and P, or whatever. So it looks like both methods are present. So any other comments from anyone on all this?
Well, I don't know how this would really fit in with what we've been reading lately, but I remember years ago the Exodus was brought up either at church or possibly in something I read or listened to. And like, oh, that's a far-fetched story. How could that happen? And whoever was responsible for the article or video or whatever said that that particular area where they probably crossed was very shallow. And it's like, okay, well, you know, that, of course, they weren't denying that the water parted either. It's like, well, it can't be too shallow. It'd be deep enough to drown someone. But in light of what we've been reading here, I was thinking to myself, oh, yeah, those big waves sucking them in sounds possible, but is the Red Sea even big enough to have waves of that size? So that's just something I wonder. You know, I bet I'm not the only person that ever heard that different people that tried to explain it away and make the Bible be the Bible, 100% true, every word. They were trying to explain how this could even have happened. Well, it was just real narrow and shallow there. Narrow, for one thing, that it wouldn't have taken them a horribly long time to cross, because it was the narrowest spot was right here. And I think they even had a picture or an old map or something like that. So I was just curious if anyone else had ever heard that or read that.
Well, I've heard that sort of thing. Go ahead.
I was just going to say I've also heard that kind of thing in Protestant church.
Yeah, exactly. I will say, though, that there have been, several people have identified places that they think are the Red Sea crossing, and there's different places, but there's debate even, okay, is this supposed to be the Red Sea or the Reed Sea? So there's debate over that. And then there's debate over whether there is even a Red Sea thing, whether this event happened at all. And, there's debate over that just from historians. There's debate from archaeologists. Because, again, this is another thing, that if there was a Red Sea event like this, there should be archaeological remains. You should be able to find these various elements of Pharaoh's army and whatever.
And I'll just interject quickly in case people listen to this and they think, oh, you guys don't know about Ron Wyatt? He found the crossing of the Red Sea. He found the chariot wheels covered in, coral, whatever, that sort of thing. And yeah.
Right. Yeah, so again, there are pseudo-archaeologists, but, things need to go through peer review. You'd have to establish the date of things. You'd have to establish, whose chariots? Are these really just finding a wheel or anything like that? Just in and of itself isn't really proof of anything other than that there's a wheel there. But
did he actually find it at all?
I don't know. I don't really know. I know that there's some stuff that he did that was absolutely just flat out fraudulent.
Yeah.
So couldn't really say beyond that. But yeah, kind of interesting. In regard to whether there was a Red Sea crossing at all, this is actually one of the things that made us question whether verse 20 belongs to E, because when you read the E source concerning the Exodus and the flight from Egypt, as it were, I'll go back and read some of what we have in E, because it paints kind of a different picture. So I'll go back to, let's see. I'll go back to chapter 14, verse 5, and I'll let you know which verses I'm going to read as I get to them. But this is all E material. So Exodus 14, verse 5b, so partway through verse 5. And the heart of Pharaoh and his servants was changed toward the people. And they said, what is this that we've done, that we let Israel go from serving us. Verse 7, and he took 600 chosen chariots and all the chariotry of Egypt and officers over all of it. Going to verse 11, and they said to Moses, was it because of an absence of graves in Egypt that you took us to die in the wilderness? What is this that you've done to us to bring us out of Egypt? Isn't this the thing that we spoke to you in Egypt, saying, stop from us and let's serve Egypt, because serving Egypt is better for us than our dying in the wilderness? Going to verse 19, and the angel of God who was going in front of the camp of Israel moved and went behind them. Verse 20, and it came between the camp of Egypt and the camp of Israel. Verse 25, and turned its chariot's wheel so that it drove it with heaviness. And then the next part goes after the Song of the Sea. But here's the thing. The way it's describing this, it doesn't mention anything about the sea at all. It's just, okay, so they're going now, they're departing Egypt. Doesn't mention a Red Sea or a Reed Sea or any crossing of a sea. It's just the chariots are pursuing Israel. And then the angel of the Lord went between the camp of Egypt and the camp of Israel, and it turned its chariot's wheel so that it drove it with heaviness. And then the next thing that you read after this in E, if you skip verse 20, is partway through verse 25, and it says, he set law and judgment there for them, and he tested them there. And he said, if you'll listen to the voice of Yahweh, your God, and you'll do what is right in his eyes and turn your ear to his commandments, etc., etc., etc. Otherwise, if you go from that point right to this Song of Miriam in verse 20, it's kind of odd how you have, and then there was this, the chariot wheels were turned so that they drove with heaviness, and then all of a sudden Miriam is rejoicing, and she sings this song saying, sing to Yahweh, for he triumphed, horse and its rider he cast in the sea. It just seems really out of the blue when there's no mention of the sea at all in E. So that's kind of one of the things that caused us to question that. E seems to have a tradition of Pharaoh and his army being stopped from pursuing the children of Israel without there being a Red Sea crossing at all. So anyway, that's something to consider. Any other comments relative to this?
So are you saying that, so then that makes the Song of Miriam really pretty random then? Because she is saying the horse and rider were cast into the sea. So there's some kind of Red Sea thing happening in E.
Well, if verse 20 belongs to E, then yeah, it's random and it seems to have something. But the other option is that since it doesn't seem to fit well within the story of E, that maybe it just doesn't belong to E. But it does fit well within the story of J, because again, in J, what happens is that, so for example, in verse, so chapter 14, verse 27, the J part of chapter 14, verse 27 says, and the sea went back to its strong flow toward morning, and Egypt was fleeing toward it, and Yahweh tossed the Egyptians into the sea. Well, go back to the Song of Miriam in verse 20, sing to Yahweh, for he triumphed, horse and its rider he cast in the sea. So it seems very much in harmony with Jay's story and it seems totally out of the blue in E's story. So it's kind of like, I think it fits a lot better in J than in E in terms of its content regarding how the Egyptians were stopped. Because, again, in E, it doesn't say anything about the sea, unless you include verse 20, but then it's just suddenly out of the blue. But in E, it's not like there's nothing that explains how Pharaoh's army didn't get them. It's just that it's not by use of the sea. It's that the angel did something to the chariot wheels to make either make the chariot wheels sink into the ground, or to make them just go very slow. The way it puts it, at least in Friedman's translation, is turned its chariot's wheel so that it drove it with heaviness. So it is giving an explanation. It just doesn't have to do with the sea.
It says E in chapter 13, verse 18. It says, it doesn't say anything. It just says, and God turned the people by the way of the wilderness of the Red Sea. But that's the wilderness of the Red Sea. So he's doing something like there. Maybe that's where he decided to cast them into the sea. I don't know. It doesn't say anything beyond that. But anyway, that's it.
Right, yeah. It does mention the wilderness of the Red Sea, but yeah, it doesn't actually specify anything dealing with the sea itself. But the other element, kind of related to the investigation of this, is the mention of Miriam, and in verse 20, it says, and Miriam, the prophetess, Aaron's sister, took a drum in her hand. So it's like, okay, Miriam is presented as Aaron's sister here. Richard Elliott Friedman noted that in E, Miriam and Aaron, okay, his footnote says, Miriam is identified as Aaron's sister, but not as the sister of Moses. In E, Miriam and Aaron are not Moses' siblings. Only in P are Aaron and Moses identified as brothers. Okay, so when he points this out, how in E, Miriam and Aaron are not Moses' siblings, is that just based on this verse, or is that tied with other passages? And if we look up the other references to Miriam, does it end up revealing something about her, which is only in E, which is in harmony with this passage, but not from the other sources? So that might be like a way to see if it's more fitting with E. And so I pulled up all the references to Miriam. The first reference in the Torah is actually right here, the one that we just read. After that, the next reference is in Numbers 12. And I actually haven't gone through these yet, but we'll quickly go through them now. There's not that many. And 12 verses 1, 4, 5, 10, and 15, those all deal with Miriam, where they mention her. And so these are all in Numbers 12 attributed to E. And I'll just read those verses. And Miriam and Aaron spoke against Moses because of the Cushite woman whom he took. Then it says, because he took a Cushite wife. Verse 4, and Yahweh said suddenly to Moses, Aaron, and Miriam, go out, you three, to the tent of assembly. So the three of them went out. Verse 5, and Yahweh went down in a column of cloud and stood at the doorway of the tent, and he called Aaron and Miriam, and the two of them went. Going down to verse 10, and the cloud departed from on the tent, and behold, Miriam was infected with a skin disease, white like snow. When Aaron turned toward Miriam, behold, she was afflicted with a skin disease. Verse 15, so Miriam was confined to the outside place of the camp 7 days, and the people did not set out until Miriam was gathered. So that's an E passage dealing with Miriam. It doesn't say whether or not she was siblings with Moses or Aaron in this chapter anyway. The next one is in Numbers 20. And Numbers 20, let's see what that is attributed to. Okay, so Numbers 20, verse 1, the first part of it is attributed to the redactor. The second part, which actually mentions Miriam, is attributed to the P source. And it just says, and Miriam died there and was buried there. Then there's another reference in Numbers 26. And Numbers 26, verse 59, also attributed to P. And it says, and the name of Amram's wife was Jochebed, a daughter of Levi, who was born to Levi in Egypt. And she gave birth for Amram to Aaron and Moses and Miriam, their sister. So this P passage definitely connects Miriam, Moses, and Aaron as being siblings. And the only other passage in the Torah mentioning Miriam is in Deuteronomy 24, and it's probably from D. And yeah, it is Deuteronomy 24, verse 9, which says, remember what Yahweh your God did to Miriam on the way when you were coming out from Egypt. So that's all that says. So in any case, so far as I can tell, that doesn't really say anything that would tell us what source it's from, as far as Exodus 15, verse 20. Basically, at least E, P, and D mention Miriam. P mentions that she was siblings with Aaron and Moses, but E elsewhere does not mention that. So if you were to select one, and D doesn't mention that either. So if you just look at verse 20 of Exodus 15 and say, well, what unique aspects does this share with other sources in terms of the Miriam aspect, you would say it connects with P, because P mentions them being siblings, and this verse does too. So you could say, well, maybe this is actually a P passage. I don't know how well it fits with P. We've never actually really, I don't know if we've really considered that possibility, but we can try reading it like that. Although I will say that just because it has this similarity doesn't mean that it's for sure part of P, because maybe more than one source has the idea that Miriam and Aaron were siblings. But I'll just read this as though it's part of P right now, and we'll just see how it sounds. So the P passage prior to this is in Exodus 14. I'll start with verse 27. And Moses reached his hand out over the sea. Going to verse 28. And the waters went back and covered the chariots and the horsemen, all of Pharaoh's army, who were coming after them in the sea. Not even one of them was left. And the children of Israel had gone on the dry ground through the sea, and the water had been a wall to them at their right and at their left. Now I'll go forward to Exodus 15, verse 20. And Miriam, the prophetess, Aaron's sister, took a drum in her hand, and all the women went out behind her with drums and with dances. And Miriam sang to them, "Sing to Yahweh, for he triumphed. Horse and its rider he cast in the sea." Going to the next P verse, Exodus 16, verse 2. And all the congregation of the children of Israel complained at Moses and at Aaron in the wilderness. And the children of Israel said to them, "Who would make it so that we had died by Yahweh's hand in the land of Egypt, when we sat by a pot of meat, when we ate bread to the full? Because you brought us out to this wilderness to kill this whole community with starvation." So that's kind of odd if it goes from the Song of Miriam all of a sudden to complaining. But you could also say, yeah, unless you're wanting to make a contrast, true. But you could also say it's odd to just go straight from the victory, the water had been a wall to them at their right and at their left, and then go immediately into complaining right there. So either way, it's a little bit odd. But the biggest thing that makes me think this probably isn't P is that, again, it's saying he cast them into the sea. And in the P account, that's not what it's describing. It's not describing the army of Pharaoh being cast into the sea. It's describing walls of water closing in on them. They walked into the midst of the sea, or into the dry ground where the sea was, and then it collapses on them. So the aspect of Miriam and her being identified as the sister of Aaron doesn't identify it with E, and it would identify it with P, but again, and that's not a necessity. It could be that J and P share that in common. But the aspect of the C seems to fit only with J, but it conflicts with the image in E, and it conflicts with the image in P. So it seems to me that it fits best with J. What do you guys think?
I agree with what you're saying. It's still confusing to me why the redactor's comment is there, though. Like, if it's all part of the J source. Unless the redactor's just trying to sort of tie in the P story, which I think you did mention at one point.
Yeah, I think he is definitely trying to tie in the P story. As to why he put it right there, that's a good question. I mean, in a sense, you could say it would make just as much sense putting it after verse 20. But I could kind of see why he might put it here, because right after this song, well, I'll put it like this. The song is what contains the elements that seem to conflict with P the most. Because in the song, you have this whole idea of being tossed into the sea and them sinking like a stone. So he might want to, like, right after that, be like, hey, this harmonizes with P, don't worry. So he might, really want to immediately tie it in so that people aren't left wondering. So he quotes the song, and then in a way to kind of explain the song, he says, because Pharaoh's horses with his chariots and with his horsemen came in the sea, and Yahweh brought back the water of the sea over them. And the children of Israel had gone on the dry ground through the sea. So it would seem like he's trying to say, like, that's his interpretation of the song. He's trying to say, well, they sang this because this happened, and then he relates how it is in P. So in that sense, I could see why he might want to put it in just like right away. But again, I could see him doing the same thing right after verse 20, but maybe he was just that eager that he wanted to have it immediately after the song. Anyway, we have now been on for an hour, so we should end tonight's meeting. We are continuing on the same topic tomorrow night, so should be good for us to pick up kind of where we left off. Would anyone like to thank our Heavenly Family?
I will. Heavenly Family, we just thank you so much for tonight's call, and we just ask that you stir our minds on these matters, make us really curious so that we read and study and try to understand what's going on. And we pray for understanding through this feast, and we thank you so much for your feast, and we thank you for the development of truth in our minds. Pray for all this in the name of the branch, he and she. Amen.
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 All right. Love you all a lot. Have a good night, and see you on tomorrow night's call.
Good night.